So good afternoon. My name is Lucan Wei. I am professor of political science at the University of Toronto and the co-director of the Petro Yatsyk program for the study of Ukraine. Today, we're going to discuss perhaps one of the most important issues in the Russo-Ukrainian war, which is Russian domestic politics. Now, I have to say that this topic has been sort of kind of gone through ups and downs. I think after it became clear that that Russia was not doing as well as many had predicted, some of us at least had this hope, which turned out to be vain, that that Russia would the regime itself in Russia would fall, either because of a military coup or because of mass protest. This has not sadly turned out to be the case. Instead, it almost, at least to those who don't, who aren't Russia specialists per se, it looks like Putin's regime has in fact been weakened. So to find out if my pessimism is warranted or there's any glimmer of hope at all, I'm joined here by four experts who can provide quite interesting and different perspectives on this conflict. First, we have Daniel Treisman, who is professor of political science at the University of California, Los Angeles. And he's just come out with a fantastic new book that's quite relevant to our discussion today, Spin Dictators, The Changing Face of Tyranny in the 21st Century. This has just come out with Princeton. I strongly encourage you to get the book. Second, we have Catherine Stoner, who is at Stanford. She is the Mosbacher Director of the Center for Democracy and Development and the Rule of Law. And she also has a new book, Russia Resurrected, Power and Purpose in Russia. And I strongly encourage you to look at both these books. Then we have, from the University of North Carolina, we have Graeme Roberts, who is a professor who has written extensively on both Russian protest, but also has a not quite as recent, but very good book on the sources of Putin's support called Putin versus the People, that has just apparently come out in paperback. So I strongly encourage you to look at that as well. And finally, we have Adam Casey, who's a postdoctoral fellow at the Weiser Center at Michigan, who has an expert in civil military relations and can give us some perspective on the possibility of a military coup. So I think I just want to start perhaps with you, Catherine. And can you just, what's your sense of the sort of public reaction to the war? I think, some of us had expected, given the fact that there are a number of deaths and stuff, many more kind of soldiers have died in this conflict than we would have expected. I mean, what's your assessment of sort of Russian domestic and mainly sort of public reaction to the war? Hello?
Sorry. Can you hear me okay?
Yep.
Okay. So I just shared my screen, and with any luck, you can see that. Can you?
Yes.
Okay, good. And so I popped up a slide here that is not great, but at least it shows you what Putin's approval rating has done during this particular action. So first, thank you very much for having me. It's great to be sort of back in Canada. I'll hold up, I'm a Canadian Girl mug here. But it's obviously this is a terrible occasion. And so far what we can see, and this is Levada data that I'm guessing everyone here has seen from the end of March here. And it's somewhat similar to, I'm not sure, my pointer may not be showing, but if you look at the arrow that says seizure of Crimea, you can see Putin's approval rating in March 2014 going from just around 60% shooting up to well over 80%. And so we're seeing something not dissimilar. This is COVID. Russia obviously has COVID's hit hard here. And then here we are at the end of March with the invasion of Ukraine and Putin's approval rating going up. Again, not quite as high, but the approval for the war is, or approval for him is pretty high. This is also the most recent polling from Levada that we have, and they did actually, the original complaint with this was that they had not shown the response rate or refusal rate, but they have since published a paper with the Chicago, it's the one that Ivo Delder runs, I'm just blanking on, the Chicago Council of Foreign Affairs, and they have said that it's consistent with other surveys that they have done, that is the refusal rate. They show it on their website. It looks a little bit higher, but not tremendously. So far it seems that what we can see a couple of things. First of all, if you added up everyone here in the top row, 53% sooner, strongly support the action in Ukraine, the military action in Ukraine. If you add up sooner yes and strongly support, then it comes out to 81% of everyone, all age groups. And then there's the notable pattern we're all pretty familiar with, that younger people, ages 18 to 24, are less enthusiastic. They feel less stridently supportive at 29%, but 42% sooner yes. So 71% overall. And this increases as the cohorts get older, and especially notable 55 and older, getting up to 64% strongly supporting the war. So the reasons they're supportive, as the slide shows on the left here, is they think they're liberating the Russian-speaking civilians of the Luhansk and Donetsk People's Republic. 25% say it's to prevent an attack on Russia. So this sort of shows you how effective Russian propaganda on state television has been, and that would be particularly true of those over 40, getting most of their news from state television. And then another 21% saying it's for getting rid of nationalists to restore order. So the question is, how accurate is this? And so there have been a couple of list experiments, and one it suggests that, I'll just give you the net, that it looks like still a majority support, that is over 50%, are supportive of the special military action in Ukraine, which isn't, of course, allowed to be called a war in Russia, but it is a little bit lower, and so there could be some preference falsification, and so you can see in the list experiment, as opposed to being asked directly, what the support drops somewhat. So I won't go into those in detail, but the other thing is that so on the one hand, we seem to see support in these surveys, even done as a list experiment, which we can talk about more in detail. On the other hand, we're seeing a large exodus of people out of the country. So literally voting with your feet. So you see this after the annexation of Crimea, and then there's some anecdotal evidence that this is starting up again. That we are seeing numbers that could be 50 to 70,000 having left in the last month, departed Russia. Others looking to leave, but finding it difficult to get a place to go. Okay, so I'll stop sharing now. The other question, so that's the public, and it's a little bit hard to know how resilient that will be, especially as time goes on and the economy begins to take more of a hit. So far, people are not blaming problems with the economy on the war. They're blaming it on the sanctions in the West, but not on Russia's actions or Putin specifically. The other group to watch, of course, is the elites around Putin, and we don't have very good information on that, but maybe the other panelists will be able to say more about that.
I think we're going to touch on that later in the discussion, but I want to that's fine. I'll kind of stick to the public opinion. So Graeme, I just want to get your sense. The fact that, maybe it's not, enthusiasm isn't quite as high as after Crimea, but the fact is that even within spitting differences is a total shock, because obviously the war is going far less well for Russia now than it was in 2014. So, what's your sense, first of all, these public opinion polls and overall public support, and why does it seem to be, if you agree with Catherine, at about as high or pretty high, given the sanctions and given the military performance and the like, and especially also given the fact that sort of, a lot of body bags have been coming home to Russia. I mean, that's, it's hard to hide that. I mean, and so what's your sense? Right.
So a few things, I think, and, that was great. Thanks, Catherine, for showing those numbers, because I think, they are pretty surprising. But I think once you start to unpack it, I think things look a little less solid. So for example, if you take that number, kind of 80% support, that includes 30% that are saying, sort of this, it's an interpretation of skорее da, right? So I that's presumably one interpretation of that is to say, well, I support the troops, obviously, but, does that mean I support what they're actually doing? There's another really interesting question on this issue that Extreme Scan have been asking, which is to say, under what conditions would you end the war? And they give people an option between, Ukraine has to capitulate, the Ukrainian armed forces have to capitulate versus end the war as soon as possible. And if you ask that question, you end up with about a 50%, which is the same as or very similar to the number in the Levada polls that say, I fully support the war. And it's the fact that those numbers, and then that also lines up with the list experiment that Catherine just showed that I hadn't seen. So it seems like that 50% number seems like a firmer kind of number. And so then the question at that point becomes, okay, we've just embarked upon this war. This war is going to go on for a long time. I think almost everybody agrees at this stage. So this early in what should be a protracted campaign, we only have 50%. So that's not much of a rally around the flag effect, I don't think. And I think it's pretty weak. And then if you ask people, to what extent have they been affected by sanctions? And again, that comes out around 50% or so of people say they're starting to be affected by sanctions. That's a smaller number than it's going to be reasonably soon, I suspect. And then you add it to a third element. So Catherine showed the numbers of the young people versus older people support for the war. The other dimension on which that appears to vary is by income. And people with higher incomes are more supportive of the war than people with lower incomes. And people who are with lower incomes and who have been affected, say they've been affected economically by the sanctions, again, a lower level of support there. So if you add that factor in, that makes me think that as the sanctions bite more and more, that's going to have a bigger effect. So I would be looking not so much in the direction of the war on the ground and sympathy for Ukraine or any of that to move public opinion, but I think the kind of self-interest in the economy is going to be really important as this thing goes forward. And then finally, I guess the last thing I would say sort of specifically on this is, I just forgot where it was. I'll get back to it, but essentially, I just think the support at this point is really thin. Oh yeah, it's casualties. So the body bags issue is really, really interesting. And directly related to public opinion. If you look at the places where the casualties are from, they tend to be Siberia, poorer regions, the North Caucasus, virtually none from Moscow and St. Petersburg, right? That's a really important statistic. And so that I would be looking at finding some of these bigger polling surveys where you actually have regionally representative samples, and I would keep a close eye on those to see, kind of what the impact of body bags are. What we've seen on social media, on Kentucky, there was a really nice study by Global Voices looking at how people are discussing the war in Ukraine in general on Russian social media, and there's a lot of pushback on social media, at least about casualties. There's basically two interpretations of pictures of casualties. One is that kind of, we have to validate, we were familiar with this from Afghanistan, right? We have to validate the sacrifices by going on and keeping the war going till we win, or, this is a wasteful, pointless exercise. And, we're burning, we're grinding up Russia's children. And both of those narratives are very strongly out there. And so I think, if I was in the Kremlin right now and I'm looking at these numbers and really thinking about them, I would not be very happy with the way this spin operation is going.
So basically, your attitude is basically it's too early. This is still very early in the conflict. There's plenty of time for the Russian-Ukrainian war to become Afghanistan. Is that sort of essentially what you're saying?
Yeah, yeah.
Okay.
And if you think about, like even if Russia is successful, right, militarily, Ukraine is going to be utterly ungovernable. Yeah, and the Americans have had, they're working very closely with Ukrainians. The Americans have had a lot of experience of insurgency operations in the last 20 years. So one thing they do know is how to run an insurgency operation, and the Ukrainians are going to be up for it. So I think, however you cut this, until Russia gets out, this war is going to drag on. We're 8 years into it, right? It's going to be another 8 years at least, unless Russia makes a radical change of course, and that's a long time for this thing to turn into a domestic disaster.
Okay, so Dan, I'm going to turn to you. I mean, you've also just written this great exciting new book about spin dictators. I guess two questions. First of all, what is your reaction to what has just been said so far about the level of public support in Russia? But also more broadly, I mean, I guess it would be, is Russia still a spin dictatorship, or does public opinion matter the way it used to, or at all?
Sure. So first of all, this discussion is great. I agree with, Catherine showing the figures extremely helpful, and I agree also with Graeme's slight note of skepticism. And I guess I would be even more skeptical than Graeme sounds at this point, because we really don't know. And the Russians who are answering these polls don't know about casualties, basically. Nobody really knows the casualty figures. And then they're not being asked, do you support the war? They're being asked, do you support the special military operation, or do you support the actions of the Russian armed forces in Ukraine, or something like that? They're certainly not being asked, do you support the commission of war crimes in Bucha, or something like that? So, it requires a great deal of interpretation, and it's not clear what people really are thinking. It's definitely possible that people support the special military operation, but don't support the war. So, we have to keep that in mind. But I think I looked at the public opinion data recently, and I was really struck, because if you take the whole Putin period, the approval rating data that Catherine showed on the graph, two factors do a remarkably good job of explaining the variation over time. And they're the obvious things. There's, first of all, economic perceptions, and secondly, these international events that cause rallies around the flag. So I wasn't so sure that economic factors still mattered that much. Apparently they do, not quite as much as before, but statistically significantly. So what do we see? Well, if we subtract from Putin's approval level a measure of economic perceptions, so the percentage who think the Russian economy is doing well, minus the percent that thinks it's doing badly. If we simply subtract that out, we get a remarkably regular graph with big surges at the beginning of Chechnya, Georgia, Crimea, Syria, and now presumably the war in Ukraine. And then we get a very regular decline after that, which goes at about 0.4 to 0.5 percentage points a month, so 5 to 6 points a year. And of course, there's some up and down, but there's a very clear downward trend at roughly that rate. So I think if we want to guess what's going to happen, we will see this big rally that we're seeing, and it'll probably go on for some more months. And then we'll see a similar kind of decline. It'll also take some time to eliminate the big surge, maybe several years, but it will continue. And the other uncertainty is the effect on the economy. So if as seems almost certain, the sanctions add to the economic problems of the Russian economy, and we see a serious economic deterioration, and that too will push down the ratings. So, I think we can expect to see deterioration in Putin's rating and in support for the war. Exactly how quickly that comes is hard to say, and it depends on those two things. But there does seem to be a lot of regularity in the way this is working out. Now, about is Russia still a spin dictator? The answer is no. It's changed to a fear dictatorship, which is Putin a spin dictator? No, he's a fear dictator now. And I see that as really having happened since about 2018. So there's been an increase in the use of overt repression in various ways. And basically now, with the start of the war, it's become absolutely clear. Civil society's been completely shut down. Independent media is completely shut down. We still don't see mass arrests or, wide-scale political killings, state political killings, as we do in many fear dictatorships. But we see the other elements pretty clearly, and it's a scary moment because the other, it could get more violent, and there's really no reason to expect that it won't at this point, because Putin is no longer trying to hide something. We're trying to present himself to the outside world and to the more liberal and modern part of Russian society as a benevolent Democrat. He's now pretty clear, with his talk about purging society and spitting out flies. He's pretty clearly owning this role of the brutal, when necessary, nationalist dictator.
So I guess the follow-up question then is, in this is sort of then should we even care? I mean, just to take the devil's advocate position, at one level you seem to have a kind of optimistic story that, Graeme, it's still early on, we could still be Afghanistan. I guess the fact that that's an optimistic story is weird, but I always hate it when people say, well, it's okay, Ukraine will be like Afghanistan. I'm like, well, I don't really think Ukraine wants to be like Afghanistan. I mean, no offense to Afghanistan. But I guess the question is sort of, does public opinion matter anymore? I mean, I remember when I was in the post-communist bloc, my aunt in Poland in 1988, I said, well, what's the public opinion in Poland? And she said, there is no such thing as a public opinion in Poland. Well, of course, she was wrong, but nonetheless, it's a worthwhile question, I think, certainly in the Russian context. So maybe, Catherine, maybe you could sort of take that up first, and then we'll get to the rest of you.
So thanks. So I think it does matter to Putin, and this is something that has been a political resource for him over time in terms of blunting the impact of any possible challenger to him as president, and there isn't an obvious challenger at this point. So I do think it matters to a certain degree, and we have seen it's not the only thing that matters, but the economy matters, but the two are linked to be sure, right? And so Russians have certain expectations of what the state should provide, and should the state not be able to provide those things, then they tend to get angry. And so we saw that with pensions, for example, when they tried to raise the pension age a few years ago, people came out onto the streets. If people were able to come out onto the streets in sufficient numbers because casualties are rising, and the spin no longer works, or they're getting access to different sources of information. Those are a lot of ifs, by the way. Then, I think his biggest fear is having people on the streets. And so Navalny is in jail on purpose so that nobody's really available to organize and get people out. Facebook shut down, Twitter shut down on purpose, right? To prevent that kind of mass uprising. So clearly it matters. And Putin can't be, to the extent anyone's trying to tell him to back down or, set a goal and let's just stick to it, and we're not going to go for Kyiv, even if we get south and eastern Ukraine. he has public opinion on his side to say, no, I think we can keep going for now. And so I do think it's a resource for him. I would agree it's not at all clear how resilient these attitudes are or will be over time. In the past, they've been able to sort of buy off or threaten soldiers who've come back from the conflict in Donbass, which has been going on, of course, since 2014, by saying we'll cut your veterans benefits if you say anything. So presumably they could still do that.
Okay, Dan, I mean, what do you think? I mean, I guess what's striking is that I've always thought of Putin as the sort of classic case of where, I mean, as your book shows, right, that, of a dictator who really cares about public opinion. I mean, this is a guy, I remember 20 years ago when some Russian analyst was saying, well, Putin's popularity will remain high indefinitely. And I thought, you're so naive, right? Like, obviously sort of, you don't have any understanding of public opinion. It's not going to last that long. And then like 20 years later, it's like the low is like 60%. I mean, give me a break. So, I mean, what is the role of public opinion now in the kind of, in the power structure in Russia, I guess, more broadly?
Well, it still matters. It matters for dictators. Putin is going to use repression. That's very clear. But it's a lot easier to maintain control with repression if you're popular than if you're not popular. And the big danger is that discontent, first of all, becomes very widespread. And secondly, that people start to express it, because then you can tip into this kind of cascade where more and more are coming onto the streets, and that affects the confidence of people in the elite. And at a certain point, people in the elite can feel that Putin is a liability if the discontent is focused on him. So he has to be very concerned about public opinion, but in a different way than he was, say, 10 years ago, where it was really important to, make it easy to win these elections without too much fraud, or without actually needing fraud. But now it's more a matter of, will discontent create the kind of corrosion, the demoralization within the regime, which could encourage defection among people at the top, and could make the whole apparatus through which he rules less reliable. So that's how I'd see it.
Yeah. Okay. So we'll definitely get to elite defection, but
Could I just add one thing to that? I completely agree with everything that Dan and Catherine have said on the role of public opinion and whatever. But I would want to make a point about fear dictatorships that I think is really important in this context. And this is not me, this is Hannah Arendt. But essentially, there's two kinds of fear we're talking about here. One is fear of the dictator, right? And so fear of repression, fear of arrests and executions and all those kinds of things. But the other thing, and then what Putin's really working on here, is fear of the other, right? Fear of the foreigner, fear of the West, fear of unreliable elements in the fifth column in our midst, and all that stuff. And that fear is designed to drive up his public opinion support. So it's not, these things are related very closely. It's not either fear or spin, it's both. These things go together, and fear is part of the spin, and the purpose of fear is to drive the numbers up.
Yeah, I mean, just one quick comment, and then I want to ask you about protests, Graeme. I mean, I guess coming at this from the point of view of someone who studies a lot of countries, autocracies, in which the dictators are a lot less popular than Putin and have survived for a very long time, none of this is very optimistic in my view. I mean, so please disabuse me of my pessimism. I would love it. But in the meantime, I mean, Graeme, a lot of this, people, both Dan and Catherine, have talked about the role of protests, and obviously this is something you've studied. So where do you see, first of all, what is your assessment of, there was sort of a spike in protests right after the invasion, and how would you assess that relative to past waves of protest, and where do you see the role of protest happening in the future? Does it have any role to play?
So, I mean, what we saw, and Dan put his finger on it, is that the repressive attitude to protest on the part of the regime has grown dramatically since 2018. And it's virtually been outlawed, essentially. And we saw the incredibly fast clampdown on protest at the beginning of the invasion. And that effectively eliminated protest entirely. And we also saw that with the clampdown on Navalny supporters when Navalny came back, and that they ended up having to cancel the protest because everyone was getting arrested, and repression really worked. Interestingly, in the kind of survey experiments we've done around that Navalny period, the emotional effect of repression was to increase anger and outrage amongst regime opponents, with no effect on moderates and on kind of independents, and on regime supporters. They were proud of it. They felt better once they saw this repression going on. So there's different audiences for this kind of thing, but I think we know from the Soviet period and from lots of other places that if a regime is really serious, and the Russian regime has all the resources in the world to throw at this, if they're serious about preventing protests, they can. And I don't think there's any reason to expect protests to get out of hand. The kind of events, and I was watching Putin at Luzhniki the other week, and I was thinking, Ceausescu and on the balcony, and maybe something like this could go wrong, right? That's kind of my fond wish. I think it's highly unlikely, but that's the only way I see kind of mass politics in the short to medium term being important in this. I'm afraid that the outlook is very bleak.
I mean, of course, at the same time, as we saw in Ukraine in 2014, repression can lead to backlash, but I guess the levels of repression simply, why isn't it leading to backlash? I mean, I think I know the answer, but tell me.
So what our survey was essentially, yes, people would have, it made them want to protest more, and it made them want to, engage in backlash, but they just can't. The sides are just not even enough in any kind of meaningful way. And Russia has more different security forces. Adam knows a lot more about this than I do, but more different security forces than you can count on the fingers of one hand. And so they're so well equipped for this, and they've had so much practice at it.
So I guess, Julia Ioffe has sort of compared, when people say, she's commented that when people expect the Russians to rise up, it's like expecting someone who's taken hostage to rise up against their hostage taker. Would you go that far with that sort of comparison?
Yeah, that seems pretty reasonable to me.
Okay, on that optimistic note, so maybe let's now turn to sort of the other big elephant in the room, which is elite politics. I'm going to start with you, Adam. I think a lot of us, one of the sort of most striking aspects of the war was the extent to which, the Russian military was utterly embarrassed and sort of held out, by its behavior, and sort of suddenly what had seemed like a well-oiled machine suddenly seemed like an utter disaster of corruption and the like. And, some of us would have expected that in the face of such military disaster, there would have been at least a serious attempt at a coup, right? If not a successful coup. And indeed, I was just, before this, I was speaking to some Myanmar democracy activists, and they asked me this exact question. I said, why isn't the military defeat leading to a military coup? So Adam, tell me, what do I tell my Myanmar friends about the likelihood of a military coup?
Yeah, well, thanks very much for having me. I did my PhD at Toronto, so it's fun to be back, virtually. So, yeah, I think there's kind of, two types of, political scientists kind of broadly define coups in kind of two different ways. There's a threat of a military coup in Russia, and there's a threat of kind of palace or sort of palace coup. And so I think Putin is kind of unlikely to be removed by either one. And so Putin inherited and then altered some of the kind of civil military relations from the Soviet Union. So the kind of there's a couple of really important elements of how the security forces are structured in Russia that are oriented towards preventing a military coup. So the kind of single most important thing is the FSB, which is Russia's primary internal security service and intelligence service, has a very large department dedicated to military counterintelligence that's embedded within the army to monitor the political reliability of Russian military officers. These agents, one of their explicit purpose, or one of their implicit and semi-explicit purposes is to prevent against military coup. There's also large non-military security services. During peacetime, we think they outnumber the army around Moscow, and so in theory are supposed to, be there to resist any kind of coup that is attempted. And so, I think, the grievances are definitely there, right? I think there's, the Russian military is unhappy with, its performance. And I think that I think there's been some commentary in the public, that maybe this is kind of coup proofing that's causing the Russian military to do so poorly. And I think that's essentially wrong. I think, the Russian military, there's to some extent Putin is to blame for its poor performance only in that, they underwent this large military modernization since 2008 that has been kind of, rife with corruption, and kind of cronies of Putin's have been kind of, getting the procurement contracts and stuff like that. And so the Russian military has a poorer logistics system than most people expected, in part because of kind of autocracy problems. But, unlike many authoritarian militaries, it isn't like Putin's nephew runs the 1st Armored Brigade in Moscow or something like that. There's not, it's a fairly professional force with kind of, at least ostensibly meritocratic officer corps. So I don't know that that's exactly why the army is doing so poorly. And then I think, the second kind of coup that Putin is, has been taking actions to prevent is something like a palace coup. And so I think you get asked a lot, like, why doesn't his inner circle remove him? So first of all, I think it's worth remembering, the consequences of moving against a dictator and failing are enormous, right? So you're looking at jail, exile, or death. And so, even if all of the kind of members of the Slovaki really thought like, we really want to get rid of Putin, it's really difficult to coordinate that kind of action. And that coordination is even more difficult because Putin, there are 4 major intelligence agencies in Russia, and they all, most of the Slovaki have kind of control one of these intelligence agencies and report up to Putin. And so it's really difficult, they're all kind of monitoring each other, and it's really unclear that they would ever be able to successfully coordinate some kind of action to remove Putin. And I think, even if they did, what would that mean for Russia? I mean, I think none of these guys are small d Democrats, but, maybe it would end the war if a sort of palace coup did remove Putin, but, and, maybe they'd be too weak to consolidate a subsequent regime, and you might see actual kind of more full regime change. But, it's really, really unclear that that's something that I think that's pretty unlikely. And I think it's the most likely thing, unfortunately, is that Putin survives this self-made crisis intact, like many other highly personalized dictators.
Right. So I'm going to sort of ask you to sort of ask you one of those annoying questions I get asked all the time, which is these impossible questions that you have no data, but your guess is better than most of our guess. So I mean, what would sort of, you've laid out a situation, very convincing case that why a coup hasn't happened, and let's say, for example, Putin clearly lost the war. It was a kind of clear military defeat, or another kind of scenario which is occurred, but I get asked about all the time, is sort of, let's say Putin goes super crazy and decides to sort of nuke somebody or in the West. What kind of scenario would you imagine would lead to a kind of coup?
Yeah, I want to emphasize that, I think all of these guys, both his inner circle and the Russian security forces, have really conditional loyalty to Putin. Like, I don't think that, many of these guys have been his allies for a long time, but yeah, there are scenarios in which they would defect, absolutely. And I think actually a kind of defection is more likely than a coup. I think this kind of refusal to, I think as Dan Treisman noted, there hasn't been a lot of high intensity coercion in Russia. And so I think as of now, I think the Russian security forces, the kind of myriad number of internal security troops, organized around Rosgvardia, have shown a clear willingness to do the kind of, roughing people up and arrests and this kind of stuff. But we haven't seen kind of, mass sustained violence. And I think, maybe I'm being sanguine here, but you could imagine, orders to kill a lot of people might be met with resistance, either resignations or an attempt to move against Putin themselves, or nuclear use or something like that. I think, I want to emphasize, loyalty is conditional, but as the other panelists have noted really, plainly, I think the barriers to mass resistance to the Putin regime are pretty considerable. It's not clear that as of now it's extremely unpopular with, the war is extremely unpopular with a lot of Russians. So I think, there are scenarios. It's hard to imagine what they might be, but as of now, I think, and especially, I think this was a question that got asked a lot early on in the war, and I think people are now kind of, less concerned about, or less. I think it's less likely there's going to be kind of military coup against Putin. So I think, and the final thing, I think, a kind of classic military coup where Gerasimov and the rest of the general staff overthrows the government is probably the least likely. I think, maybe one of his kind of, members of his inner circle moving against him, Bortnikov or Naryshkin or something, but is possible, but unlikely.
So just to be clear, what's your, just explain to us more, what's the distinction between elite defection and a coup?
Yeah, so dictators, so security force loyalty is really important to the collapse of dictatorships. So in some scenarios, mass protests call for the oust of the regime, the dictator orders repression, and the security forces say, we're not going to do it anymore. And so, Yanukovych in February of 2014, after the first repression, the SBU and other members of the Ukrainian state, other security forces just said, like, we're not going to be involved in this anymore. And he effectively had no levers left to pull to order the repression he thought was necessary to save the regime. And so that kind of defection, it's a little different than a coup, which is where the security forces say, not only are we not going to use force, but you also have to leave office. So Morales didn't actually order repression in Bolivia in 2019, but the Bolivian army said, essentially you have to go. And so the security forces can defect in the sense that they can say, we're not going to fire on, protesters. And that may, effectively deprive Putin of the capacity to use the force he might think is necessary to keep him in power. That being said, there are a lot of different security forces in Russia. And then, the other way is, when ordered to use repression or in other contexts, the security forces can move themselves directly against the dictator and sort of say, you must resign or, overthrow him themselves. And I think that latter scenario is less likely, but just kind of, guessing.
Okay. So maybe I'll turn to you, Catherine, to talk about sort of elite defection. You began to talk about that earlier. So Sam Green, Graham's co-author, right after things began to heat up with sanctions, sort of gave this prediction, which made me very optimistic that this was the first time that the interests of the Russian elite as a whole diverged from the interests of Putin. And so I think a lot of us, not just Sam, but a lot of us sort of thought, well, yeah, like maybe a sort of a serious defection was possible. And I guess, first of all, do you agree with that my assessment that the interests of the elite, Russian elite, have diverged from Putin? And second, why haven't there been more defections
So thanks. And Adam, super interesting. Thank you. I think there's also, so just from the military, there's also, they didn't, there is a history of civil military separation. So it's not quite like the Latin American experiences, I suppose. So I wouldn't have expected a military coup, but why no alternative elite coup, or at least not yet? Well, they're being sanctioned pretty heavily. So I think Dan had raised earlier, maybe it was Graeme, someone had raised earlier that you have to sort of do a calculation if you're, Abramovich or I think Agit Alekperov just stepped down from Lukoil. Did he step down or was he kind of pushed out? Because Lukoil was one of the few companies that actually said this isn't a great thing. That is the invasion. So they hold their assets, right? There are two sets of elites. They're the elites from the 1990s, the Abramoviches who are still kind of, and Friedmans who are still surviving. Friedman, I think, is out now. Abramovich, we are seeing him try to participate in peace negotiations, not very effectively, but he's had to sell Chelsea if he actually ever really owned it, or whether, if you believe Catherine Belton, this is all FSB money moving around. But nonetheless, all of these people, either the oligarchs that Putin had created in the 2000s, and that close circle around him from St. Petersburg, so whether or not they're going to defect from him, I don't think they're ever going to defect from him. But regardless, even the oligarchs of the 90s, the oligarchs of the 2000s he's created, they all hold their assets at the pleasure of Vladimir Putin. So while we're sanctioning them, and that's very uncomfortable, and their mistresses can't get to their homes in Geneva or whatnot, they won't have homes in Geneva if Putin goes down, presumably, or quite likely. I think we have to see if we get to a tipping point when the sanctions are so hard on them, and they, their assets, obviously these guys are starting to lose billions of dollars anyway, then it might make sense to try to get together and say, hey, especially if his popularity or approval ratings are declining around the Russian people, and let's say there were some demonstrations and they're, can't access these assets they've amassed, then he's a liability. I don't know that we're going to ever get to that tipping point, but that's why I do think it's pretty unlikely, because their assets are, and having those assets and access to them they're completely dependent on him, that it seems pretty unlikely. that we'll see that kind of palace coup.
Right. So Dan, I mean, do you think that sanctions, following what Catherine said, I mean, are sanctions strengthening the Putin's regime?
No, I don't think they're strengthening Putin's regime. And I think, we're kind of talking about the low odds that there's going to be any kind of mass protests. And I think we're talking about mass anti-war protests. But I think economic protests are much more likely. So as time goes on, as the effect of the sanctions becomes clearer and more painful for ordinary people, I think it's really not hard to imagine that there would be major waves of economic protests. And it would be harder for Putin to repress those because they'll have broader support. People will understand, and within the security services too, people may have more sympathy. So I think that's something that's going to happen. And I think the sanctions, they haven't really had anything like their full effect yet. That's going to come as all these factories have to stop producing because they can't get the inputs of the intermediate goods. So that's going to come. Just to add a footnote to the very interesting things that Adam said about Putin's very effective coup proofing. There's a neat article by Nikolai Petrov and a couple of colleagues looking at the networks, really tracing the networks within the elites. And looking at who went to school together, who served together, who socializes together. And one interesting thing that leaps out from their network diagram is that certain key leaders within the security forces are completely isolated except for their connection to Putin. So Bortnikov, for instance, the only link is the one that ties him to Putin. He doesn't socialize with the others. And most of the others also have relatively few links, either in terms of their personal history or in terms of socializing today with other members of the elite, which is another way that it becomes hard for them to coordinate and organize anything or even think about going against Putin. And I agree with Catherine, why would these people want to? I mean, it's not like the West is going to be welcoming them with open arms. They're viewed as culpable, if not more culpable than Putin for all the bad stuff that's been happening. So that's tough. They would really have to remake themselves and resell themselves. One question I had with regard to what Adam was talking about was, is it possible to coup-proof too well, in the sense that he's created all these security forces, and although he hasn't, as Adam said, he hasn't appointed his nephews to lead the army and the Air Force and so on, he's got some pretty strange people in other roles, like Zolotov. Everybody seems to agree he's a complete idiot. Ramzan Kadyrov. And all these forces seem to hate each other, which is part of the point. That's how you coup-proof. But is it possible that as things go worse in the war, if they do, the tension rises, and Kadyrov and Zolotov and Bortnikov and Patrushev and the army generals run into conflicts that destabilize the regime? I mean, the way I see it breaking down is much more about destabilization rather than some sort of carefully planned conspiracy, which is then implemented. That you have mass economic protests, demoralization in the army, this kind of conflicts breaking out, and it just becomes too much for Putin to handle. And he does something stupid, which makes it worse. And you get into uncharted territory. So I'm curious if Adam, for instance, and if the others agree that that's kind of conflict between different factions could actually end up being dangerous.
That's a great question, Dan. I mean, I will turn it to you, Adam. I mean, yes, right. So far, we've sort of taken it as a given that Russia has a strong state, which, I think relative certainly to other autocracies, it's certainly well-funded and quite coherent. I mean, what is your sense, Adam? Like, what is the, outside of a coup, but what is your sense of a kind of, what is the sense that Russia will start to look more like these sort of African dictatorships where there's sort of extreme, more levels of sort of elite disunity and sort of open infighting and sort of kind of almost kind of quasi-state breakdown?
Yeah, it's a great question. So I mean, I really agree with everything Dan brought up. So I would say that yes, absolutely. You know, you can coup-proof too much. I think there's a larger literature than there used to be that sort of demonstrates empirically that, you know, militaries that are organized primarily around preventing coups are much worse at fighting interstate wars. I think, again, I would caution, I think that the main way in which coup-proofing has actually really harmed, you know, Russia's performance in this war is in the bad intelligence. So I think, you know, having multiple competing overlapping intelligence agencies that have essentially no incentives to speak truth to power and where incompetence can be viewed as disloyalty, I think had, you know, most of the reporting by America's own intelligence agencies and just kind of everybody else suggests that, you know, Putin was not really getting a lot of adverse information. The sort of fifth department of the FSB was saying, hey, look, this is going to be pretty easy. Like the Ukrainian state doesn't have a lot of legitimacy. Zelensky will never fight. The West, I mean, so a lot of really faulty political assumptions went into the military strategy that underpinned this war. I mean, if you think about what the Russian army did in the beginning of the war is they sent a bunch of elite troops to attempt to decapitate the regime in Kiev. Did not think, you know, on the second day of the war, Putin called on the Ukrainian army to launch a coup, to take power into their own hands, was his exact words. And I think, you know, they really underestimated the you know, willingness of Ukrainian units to fight, of the tenacity of Zelensky and of the unified Western response. And so I think all of these, you know, the sort of military plan was, you know, it was based on a bunch of faulty assumptions, I think, that are in part to blame from the kind of, you know, really the sort of rational consequences of the intelligence system that Putin sits at top of, which is ironic given that he was a former intelligence officer who presumably disliked the kind of political interference and intelligence in the late KGB. And so I think the fact that he's kind of recreated that same system is somewhat ironic. But yeah, I mean, I don't know. I mean, I sort of agree with that. The sort of, you know, crumbling is the way of the regime going down rather than a kind of, you know, swift and unified elite coup or something like that. Zolotov, I mean, I think the standard, you know, in the kind of literature now on sort of security forces and repression and dictatorship is that, you know, for the types of tasks the National Guard is being asked to do, loyalty is better than competence. I mean, if Zolotov is willing to use force, then that is better than him being good at his job. You know, I think shooting into crowds requires less kind of tactical superiority than you know, launching a coup might. And so I think that being said, you know, I think the one argument I think you could maybe make for kind of coup prevention strategies, decreasing Russian battlefield effectiveness. We don't really know why there was no overall theater commander until a couple of weeks ago. You know, that may have been some kind of Putin micromanaging his generals. And the other is that there was a lot of evidence of poor coordination between Rosgvardia troops and the Ministry of Defense. Why the Rosgvardia troops were ever going out in the head of the regular army is, you know, just incompetence, I think, rather than kind of coup prevention or something. But other dictatorships send their rivals to the front so they'll die, you know. So Lon Nol in Cambodia was sending essentially every competent general he had to the front so that they could get killed and not launch coups. I don't really think that's probably what's going on here, but that is obviously a thing in other dictatorships. So it's not that's not a kind of crazy argument.
But those are, you know, really weak dictatorships. So, you know, I mean, if Russia's getting in the Lon Nol territory, then we're already that's full on Dan. But
yeah, and I want to agree with Catherine. Like the Russian military, I mean, they inherited, you know, the Soviet system, you know, resulted in sort of penetrating and subordinating the army that by its kind of late Soviet period, the army just kind of would have thought it unthinkable to try to kind of, I mean, although the August coup is an interesting thing in itself. But anyways, I mean, I think I agree, you know, the Russian military is a mixture of kind of, you know, it's normal to be under civilian control. And also there's a lot of different institutions that are oriented towards sustaining that loyalty to the civilian regime, like the FSB counterintelligence and stuff.
Okay. So I'm just going to wrap it up with the last question for you, Graeme. So we've gotten several questions in the chat. And also this was something that Dan raised, which was, you know, obviously Putin's, you know, Dan says that Putin's regime has become a fear dictatorship or Putin is a fear dictator, or you know, back in 2018. But obviously, as Dan mentioned, there's a long way to go to full North Korea. There haven't been mass arrests or mass killings. One of the questions on the chat was, you know, why is Navalny still alive? So I have a question. So Graeme, I mean, you know, you obviously can't answer the question of why Navalny is still alive, or maybe you can. You know, what would, I guess, what would it take, or how likely are we to see kind of a more severe kind of full North Korea in Russia? Or is that kind of out of the question given sort of levels of modernity and the internet and stuff and the like?
So that's Leonid Volkov, who, as most of you know, is Navalny's right-hand man, would say that the full North Korea is impossible until the people are eating grass, right? That's his line, and you know, it's just not within the realm of possibility to oppress people as much as that. I do worry, though, that these conflicts within the elite that Dan and Adam were talking about, you know, Putin's job is to resolve those conflicts, right? That's been his job since the very beginning. And so the question is, what methods does he start to use to resolve those? And does he, you know, resort to show trials and those kinds of things to do so? And I think that's you know, not at all with the realm of probability. And so the level of violence, I think, is going to be a function of the extent to which we see that kind of conflict and what Putin's strategy for resolving it is. I wanted to comment on something that Dan said about economic protests breaking out, and then one could easily imagine them. And that's a really interesting question to which I don't know the answer, but I've been kind of scribbling down variables that I think might affect its likelihood. And it you know, it makes me think about the 1990s when you had this massive contraction in GDP, and we didn't have waves of mass protests. What we had instead were lots and lots of isolated wildcat kinds of protests, in part because there was not the organizational capacity to link them up, in part because without that organizational capacity, it was hard to focus the blame on somebody. And then in part because most of it was in the provinces and not and Moscow and St. Petersburg were doing much better. And so I think to the extent that we're like to see economic protests really happen, and to the extent to which they're going to have any political impact, depends on those three variables. How well those can be organized and coordinated with one another. To what extent does the war make it easier to focus blame on Putin, the war and the sanctions? And so it becomes a clear political target, and instead of everyone seeing, you know, the economic problem as being about an individual need to get their wages paid, and more of a systemic set of issues in which people share the problem, and then the degree to which Moscow and St. Petersburg get dragged down by this. Those, I think, are going to be three critical variables that are going to shape whether or not the economic protests that are possible, you know, really grow into something that would be politically significant.
So, I mean, obviously, it's hard to speak to the latter two, or, I mean, I don't know. But certainly, I mean, you should be able to speak to the question of coordination. I mean, in the 1990s, that was, you know, arguably kind of pre-internet age, or kind of just at the, you know, dawn of internet. And clearly now people are much more connected. I mean, is coordination now easier because of organizational issues or internet than you might have expected? Or
oh yeah, I mean, if you look at Navalny's organization, that's the model, right? The you know, the kind of networked system that they have. Unfortunately, what's happened is so many of these people have been drowned out of the country by previous rounds of repression, that they would need to be replaced by other people. But the model is there, and the question is, to what extent is the regime going to be, you know, able to monitor and pick up on people who start becoming incipient organizers of this? And, you know, right now the technology is definitely there for people to do this, you know, without, you know, kind of in a hidden and secret way. And so that arms race over communications technology is, you know, a major part of this process.
Right. I mean, and Navalny himself seemed to, at least the outsiders, seemed to come out of nowhere, right?
Right.
Right.
Oh yeah, and one of the things, if you ask people about previous protest participation, every time there's kind of a wave, almost everybody's new. There are people who go on from one protest to the other, but the vast majority of people are new, which is really interesting.
Okay, well, thank you, Adam, Graeme, Catherine, and Dan. That was a very interesting discussion, and maybe we'll have, you know, someday we'll have a discussion about post-Putin, but I think that's a little premature. So with that, thank you everyone for joining us. We have events twice a week, so stay tuned, and thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Bye. Thanks for having us.
Bye, thank you.
Yeah, thanks for having me.